Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com, and today we are in round 2 of our coverage of the 2018 Canada's tournament. And round 1 had some fireworks. A lot of people expected players to come out, not be overly aggressive and try to push for wins because there are 14 rounds. Last thing you want to do is try an extremely aggressive line and then end up on the losing end of that, knowing that there's so many strong players. We've just seen that over time in high-level competition. But of the 4 matches, 3 of those we had wins with Vladimir Kramnik, we had Shakir, and then Fabiano Caruana all getting victories in round 1. In round 2 today, we have 2 of the losers from those matches. Alexander Grishuk, who lost to Vladimir Kramnik, and Wesley So, who lost to Fabiano Caruana. Grishuk's going to be playing the white pieces. So's going to be playing the black pieces for the second day in a row. Both these players looking to get back on track as they did get beat in round 1. So we'll go ahead and get started with Alexander Grishuk, pawn to e4. Pawn e5, knight f3, knight c6, and then bishop here to b5, getting into the Ruy Lopez. Now pawn to a6, the main line. Bishop coming back here to a4, knight f6, castle on the king side, and then bishop to e7. This is the closed defense, the main line in the Ruy Lopez. Pawn to d3, though, is somewhat an unusual move. Usually from white, we're seeing rook here to e1, or even knight to c3 is pretty popular as well. But pawn to d3 doesn't see a lot of play. Interesting that fellow countryman Peter Svidler actually did a series on pawn to d3. So not sure if Peter Svidler was talking to Alexander Grishuk, telling him that, hey, you should actually try this pawn to d3 move out in the Ruy Lopez closed defense. But that's exactly what we see here. So after pawn to d3, pawn to b5, kicking the bishop back here to b3. Pawn d6, solidifying the pawn chain. So both sides very, very similar in their pawn structures. This is why it's called a closed defense. Really just locking down the center of the board, not an open game at all. Pawn to c3, another interesting move from white. The approach from Grishuk is to play an opening that Wesley So is not super familiar with. Pawn to c3 is the move. Castle on the king side, and then pawn to h3. And this pawn to h3 is usually what we see instead of pawn to c3. Just pawn h3, stopping the knight coming down here, or even the bishop coming down, pinning down the knight to the queen here on d1. And then just waiting to see what black does from here, which is usually going to be castle on the king side, followed by rook to e1 for white. But in the game, we see that pawn to c3, castle, and then pawn here to h3. Bishop to b7, this is Fincutting the bishop over here to the queen side of the board, getting it involved to attack these light squares in the center of the board, really trying to put pressure on these light squares. And then knight to d2, protecting the knight here on f3, as well as if it needs to push forward with pawn to c4, try to defend the center of the board, he can do that as well. Rook to e8, this is interesting. Anytime your opponent moves, you always want to be looking at what did they give up? Were they defending a particular piece? Do you have 2 pieces attacking a square and then all of a sudden they have 1 after they moved and it was a mistake? All of a sudden you can see that this bishop here on b3 is attacking the square here on f7. The rook and the king were both defending it. Now that the rook has moved, only the king is defending this right here. So we see Alexander Grishuk immediately play knight to g5. The knight and the bishop are both attacking this pawn, a critical square early on, especially in the Ruy Lopez when we get into the closed defense. And so we see Wesley So decide to go ahead and just bring his rook back here to f8. So it's not real clear if the knight on g5 gives white really that significant advantage, but white is up a move in the game because now rook over here to e1, and white theoretically has moved twice, as black has wasted 2 moves, rook here to e8 and then back to f8. Pawn to d5, so Wesley So decides to go ahead and break up the center of the board. We do see an exchange in the center of the board, and then knight to f3. Now, queen to d7. Always, when you look at this and say, okay, we have this pawn here on e5, both the knight and the rook here on e1 are attacking this, and only the knight here on c6 is defending this. Something seems to be going on here. Why would they allow that? The issue would be is after the queen comes down here to d7, not defending this square, the knight can't just take the material. So if we see knight takes on e5, Knight recaptures, rook takes. The key move here would be pawn to f6, attacking both the knight and the rook. One of these pieces is going to fall. If white decides, I'll just go ahead and gobble up some material here. Rook takes on e7, queen takes. Knight's just going to fall back to e4. White's going to lose material in that exchange, so not going to be looking to do that. So after queen to d7, instead of taking the pawn that maybe looks like it is undefended by more than one piece, white decides to go ahead and play pawn to d4. Black decides to take that pawn there on d4, and then Grishuk responds with recapturing here on d4. And white has an isolated pawn in the center on d4. Now, the way Grishuk's playing, it does look like he's confident in this particular line, but it does give Wesley so something to plan around. He can start to attack this, knowing that white's going to have to spend all of his material defending this instead of using his pawns. One thing that you'll notice in this position is that the board has completely opened up. While we started out with the Rai Lopez closed open, all of a sudden we have the pawns coming off the board. We have both sides with all of their major and minor pieces. So there could definitely be fireworks as both sides are really looking to stay aggressive in the game. Pawn to h6 forces the knight to come back here to e4. Rook to e8, so both sides try to activate as much material as possible. Bishop to d2. White really wants to bring his rook here to c1. There's not a lot of great squares for the bishop. Doesn't want to come here to g5. That would be a terrible move. Just lose the bishop. Then if it comes here to f4 or e3 as well, both of those squares the knight could exchange off the board. Anytime you have an open board state, you really want your bishops on the board. They can just control so much more of the board than a knight can in this position. So not looking to do that. So instead we see bishop here to d2. It really just is for the rook to come here to c1. So the white can really control these semi-open files and open files in the center of the board. Knight back here to f6, rook to c1. We do see an exchange, and then the rook up here to e4. If we come back and say, okay, the knight takes here on e4, but why would the knight just not take here on a d4? This is a poison pawn. It may look like it is okay to take, but it's actually not. While yes, it is true that the knight could take, knight recaptures, and then the queen takes, it does look like black is good in this position. The problem is that if the knight were to take here, then white can actually come up here and take on f7. Now, there's a few moves as far as how black could continue. You can probably see right away if the king takes here on f7, then we have a fork, knight to e5, check. This is pretty much going to just get a resignation from black. The queen is going to fall. If we see instead the king does not take, so he has a few other options. He could play king to h7. Okay, here's where things get pretty interesting. I would say complicated to find for white, but at the highest level, they could absolutely find this line. Knight to g5, and then, what does black do from here? It's going to be bad if he takes with pawn on to g5. The knight's going to come up here to f6, check. After the pawn takes, queen to h5, and it's going to be a quick death march up here for a checkmate. Now, if we come back and say, what if the pawn doesn't take that? Okay, well, then we could just see the king come back here to h8. Doesn't have a lot of good options here. Knight takes here on f6. After the pawn takes, queen up here to h5. Things are going to get very, very bad as we see this queen getting ready to take here on h6. Maybe the knight comes to f5, stopping the queen coming from here. But then queen up here to g6. It's now attacking this knight. All of a sudden, the rook can get involved into the game. Maybe the pawn takes, rook takes here on e7. After the queen takes, bishop to c3. And this is so tough because the bishop coming here is another fork. If the queen moves, though, if it's not defending the square, then all of a sudden it is going to be mate. So there's no great way for black to really respond to this. If he tries something with his rook, maybe rook to g8, attacking white as much as possible. Yes, white could just take this if he wanted to, but then that fork comes into play. So all in all, black is going to end up losing in this situation. Knight to d4, not a good play. So we don't see that from Wesley. So instead, knight takes on e4, and then rook takes on e4, recaptures. Bishop here to f5, attacking this isolated pawn. We now have the knight, the bishop, and the queen all attacking this isolated pawn. It also opens up the door for this rook on e8 to control this open file, really countering this rook here on e4 from Alexander Grishuk. Instead of trying to hold on to the material here on d4, white goes on the offensive. He plays rook to g4, setting up the bishop taking here on h6. The pawn can't recapture because it is being pinned down by the rook to the king here. So we see king to h8. And this is where I think Wesley missteps and freaks out a little bit by the threat that white has. A move like pawn to h5, not too worried about bishop here to h6. You're just going to take that material here. That's pretty easy. So white's not going to be doing that. It also forces rook to really move and figure out where he's going to go with an attack. Yes, it does extend the material on the king side of the board, but you got to do something. You can't let your opponent continue to attack you. He has so much material lined up at your king side. Both his bishop are lined up here. He has a rook bring over here to g4. Somewhat disrespectful. I would just try to kick that off with pawn to h5. Another option would just be rook to d8. Says, yeah, I don't really care. If you want to take this material right here, I have protection with my bishop on f6 for the square here on g7. That's fine. I'm going to just gang up on the center of the board. I have so much material lining up here. That's going to be fine with me. But in the game, Wesley So sees this and he responds with king to h8. Now rook to c5, and you can see things getting pretty aggressive on board here. Rook to d8, I think it's a little bit too late, and then queen to c1. So this rook coming up here to c5, it's an outpost move, does allow the queen to come over here, support it, as well as support this bishop as well. Now the bishop could take here, and can't really be captured by the pawn here on h6 because then the queen could come up here and there would be checkmate. Has the queen here on h6 as well as the rook here on g4. So not going to be seeing that from Wesley. So after the queen to c1, takes the pawn here on d4, that isolated pawn. Knight recaptures, rook down here to e4, trying to exchange that material. But we don't see an exchange right away. Rook up here to c7. Always want to get your rooks to your opponent's 7th rank if you are playing as white. Just so many attacks that you can have. You can see already attacking both the bishop and the queen. Queen's going to be forced to move, as well as attacking these pawns as well. Queen does come down here, takes on d4, bishop to e3, forcing black to respond. Rook over here takes on g4. We do see an exchange, and now the queen is forced to move. Decides to come here to e4, pawn up here to f3, queen over here to b4, and then the rook is free to take the bishop here on b7. So yes, all of a sudden we see on the board the black is down to material. He can gain back material here. He plays this bishop down here to b2, so he does get one pawn back, but he is down a bishop. If this move does look odd to you because, yeah, he took this pawn, but the queen can just take it. This is where a lot of players go wrong in chess. They may just decide, let's go ahead and take this material. And this is where I like to tell players that even if you are behind, black is clearly behind, an entire bishop going into the endgame is very difficult to come back from. Now, this is an open game, so many times black can find a strong attack, and white can always make a mistake, especially if you're not at the highest level. But one thing that you can do, especially if you're black, is play something like bishop to b2. Just saying, hey, opponent, you should go ahead and take with your queen right here. This is actually a drawn game because queen to e1 check. There's no other move besides king to h2. Only optional move. Now queen to h4 check. Only move again is king back here to g1, and they could just do this, and this would end up being a draw. So it doesn't matter how much of an advantage white has on board, this is going to end up being a drawn game. So don't fall into this. Always be looking, why would my opponent do this? And if I'm up in material, does my opponent have the option to have a perpetual check that would end up just drawing the game? So we see Alexander Grishuk play a queen to f1, pawn here to f6, queen to f2, bishop up here to e5, and both sides, really just trying to do anything they can. Black side really trying to find some attack. White really just trying to hold on. He doesn't have to force anything. He has the much better in game. So all in all, just needs to make sure he does not make a mistake. Bishop comes back here to d6. Pawn up here to g5, trying to exchange down. If you're up in material, many times exchanging down material just makes your advantage that much more prominent in the game. Queen over here to e4. Queen up to f3 says, hey, if you want to exchange on board, that's going to be fine with me. Queen down to b1. Queen down f1. Could have also, if you wanted to, just play king to f2. I think this is a great move as well. There's no strong attack that black has here just with his queen, and he is blocking off his rook here on d8 to really get involved into the game. But that's okay. Instead of king to f2, we do see queen down here to f1, really just telling his opponent, hey, let's just go and exchange on board. Queen to e4, queen up here to f3. We do see a little bit of song and dance. We don't want to see the threefold repetition. If you have the same board state 3 times, it would be a draw. So white's not looking to do that. So now he plays the king to f2, which is probably the better move all in all. Bishop down here to b4. Queen to e2, queen up here to e4, queen f3, and now king to g3. So same sort of situation where don't want to have the same board state 3 times. So plays king here to g3. It's a pretty safe square. How does black really attack this from here? Pawn takes, king down here to h2. Queen up to f5, sure, rook over here to f7. This is being protected by the bishop here on b1 or b3, and can't really attack this bishop here on b3 with any of the materials, so that's always good. And if you look at it, it's always nice to see, how white's setting this up. Black has this one bishop, and it's on a dark square. So what's white doing? He's putting all of his important pieces on light squares. He has his bishop, he has his rook, he has his queen here on light squares. He really just has his bishop and his pawn here on dark squares, but very, very easy to figure that out and make sure he doesn't make a mistake. Queen up here to g6, pawn takes, bishop up here to d6, check, and then king to h3. And this is where that last dagger where, okay, now pretty much all my material is on the light squares. And then at the end of the day, there's just not much that black can really do here. So decides to go ahead and resign. Alexander Grishuk, just too much material in the endgame, especially with the bishop pair, and just putting so much pressure on his opponent. No way for Wesley to continue. So Wesley Stowe losing the first 2 games in the Candace tournament, not the start that he was looking for. Grishuk coming back strong after a loss in the first round, so he's back on track. We'll be looking to move up the leader ranks. No one else won today. So everyone that won yesterday that had the full point, they were only able to get half a point today. So Grishuk is only half a point behind, and he does have 12 rounds remaining. But hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. We do have 12 more rounds of coverage to go through. It has been an exciting tournament already. Excited for the next few weeks of chess. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.